The fire was still smoking when the forestry workers found her. It was December 30th, 1979, in the Jarrah bush off Brookton Highway, near a rock formation the locals called Boulder Rock, outside a small settlement named Carrigaline, southeast of Perth. A woman's body lay slumped over a smoldering stump. She had been beaten, then set alight. She was 22 years old. Her name was Karen Tate. For 45 years, the man who killed her walked free, raced yachts, drank at his local, and died without ever hearing his own name spoken as a suspect. Then, in 2025, a DNA sample sealed in a police evidence locker since the year Karen died finally spoke. It didn't just name her killer. It may have named two more. She carried a black motorcycle helmet everywhere she went. Not because she owned a bike, she didn't. She carried it in case someone did. If a stranger on two wheels ever pulled over and offered her a lift, she wanted to be ready. That was Karen Tate. She hitchhiked everywhere. It was simply how she moved through the world. Karen Mary Tate was born in Victoria in April 1957 and raised in New South Wales. In 1978, at 21, she gave birth to twins. One of them died. Not long after, she left the East Coast behind, crossed the Nullarbor, nearly 2,000 kilometers of nothing, and arrived in Perth completely alone. 3,000 kilometers from everyone she knew. She was 22, and she was starting again. By the summer of 1979, she'd been in the city about a year, renting a room on Barley Street in Mount Lawley, a suburb of Edwardian houses and wide, quiet streets just north of the city center. She didn't own a car. Her friends were scattered across the suburbs, Cotslow, Swanbin, the hills, and most weekends she was on the move between them, thumb out, helmet in hand. She was part of Perth's inner-city arts community, drifting through share houses and gatherings, the kind of young woman people remembered easily but few knew deeply. In the months before her death, she'd started attending introductory talks on witchcraft, 13 sessions over about a quarter of the year, though she was never initiated into any coven. It was curiosity, not commitment. A woman rebuilding a life after losing a child, testing out a new city, a new circle, a new version of herself. 5 days before she died, on Christmas Day 1979, Karen shared a drink with a family in Carrigaline, a small settlement in the hills southeast of Perth. They noticed the jewelry she was wearing that day, a watch, an earring, a bangle, a pendant, a ring. Small details, the kind you only remember afterward when someone asks you to. She had agreed to house-sit for that family while they were away. It was a simple plan. Get to Carrigaline, stay at the property, look after the place until they returned. She never got there. Perth in the late 1970s felt like the edge of the earth. It sat closer to Singapore than to Sydney, cut off from the rest of Australia by 1,000 kilometers of desert. The population had just passed 1 million. The city ran along the Swan River, from the port of Fremantle in the west to the foothills of the Darling Range in the east. The same hills that swallowed Karen 5 days after Christmas. The summers were warm and the pace was slow. People left their doors unlocked. Young women hitchhiked alone and nobody thought twice about it. A girl could stand on a curb with her thumb out and climb into a stranger's car, and it wasn't reckless. It was just how you got from one side of the city to the other. Karen didn't own a car. She didn't need one. The city moved her along on whatever ride happened to stop. That trust was the texture of everyday life in Perth. Nobody was counting on it to fail. But Karen's route that day wasn't a short hop across town. Carrigaline sat about 40 kilometers southeast of the city, deep in the Jarrah forest of the Darling Range foothills, a world away from Mount Lawley's Edwardian streets. To get there, she'd need more than a short ride. She'd need someone heading her way, someone willing to take her all the way into the hills. How she planned to make that trip was never recorded. But anyone who knew her could guess. She'd have stood on the curb, helmet under her arm, and waited for whoever stopped next. Somebody did. On the evening of Friday, December 28, 1979, Karen Tate went to a dance at the North Cotslow Surf Life Saving Club, right on the coast west of the city. She spent that night at a friend's place in Swanbin, a beachside suburb a short drive from the club. The next morning, Saturday, December 29th, That friend drove her back across the city to Mount Lawley and dropped her on Barley Street at around 11 a.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of Karen Tate. 11 o'clock in the morning, on the curb of her own street, with her helmet in hand and a plan to reach Carrigaline by nightfall. From that point on, every line of inquiry police would later pursue came up short. What happened between 11 a.m. and the moment her body was found the next day was pieced together only in fragments. Reports, guesses, one uncorroborated sighting. A witness later told police she'd seen a young woman riding on the back of a motorcycle with a man, heading toward the hills that afternoon. Whether it was Karen has never been confirmed. 5 days earlier, at that Christmas gathering in Carrigaline, Karen had already discussed the plan to look after the property. The family expected her. She never arrived. Then, on January 3, 1980, just days after her body was found, a young woman called Crime Stoppers anonymously. She said she'd been walking with her boyfriend when she saw a girl on a motorbike with a man crossing the road into the bush. She wouldn't give her name. She never called back. The rider was never identified. That's the entire record of Karen Tate's final hours. A driveway drop-off at 11 a.m., an unconfirmed sighting on a motorbike heading into the hills, and an anonymous caller too afraid or too uncertain to leave a name. Somewhere in that gap, on a Saturday afternoon in the summer of 1979, Karen Tate met the person who would kill her. By evening, she was in the Jarrah Forest south of Brookton Highway, at a clearing called Boulder Rock, a formation the locals knew by name, hemmed in by tree trunks on every side, 800 meters off the highway down a gravel track. No house stood within sight of it. Whoever brought her there had gone looking for somewhere out of view, from any road and any door. Around 6 p.m., a forestry worker reported smoke rising from the bush. By the time anyone reached it, the flames were already out. The ground was still warm. The smoke had already stopped rising by the time anyone reached the clearing. The forestry worker who reported it had seen it from a distance, south of Brookton Highway. Whoever went in to check found only warm ground and dying embers. The fire had already done what it was going to do. The body itself wasn't formally located until the next morning, December 30th, 1979. She was slumped over a smoldering tree stump in a small clearing at Boulder Rock, hemmed in by Jarrah trunks on every side. The ground beneath her was blackened. The air still carried the smell of burnt eucalyptus oil, hanging still in the bush. The post-mortem found severe head and facial injuries, caused by a heavy piece of wood. She had been beaten before the fire was set. Whoever killed her had then built the fire around her body, feeding it with whatever the forest floor offered: bark, fallen branches, dry leaves. The flames had charred her remains, but they hadn't consumed them. Not entirely. That mattered more than anyone in that clearing could have known in 1979. There was no formal identification through fingerprints or dental records that morning. Instead, it was a pendant, the one the Carrigaline family had noticed her wearing at their Christmas gathering 5 days earlier, that told investigators exactly who was lying in that clearing. Karen Tate, 22 years old, last seen on a curb in Mount Lawley, waiting for a ride into the hills. The scene told investigators two things immediately. This was not a robbery, and this was not random carelessness. Someone had beaten her, killed her, and then taken the additional step of building a fire around her body, in a location chosen specifically because it couldn't be seen from any road or any house. Whoever did this had planned, at minimum, where to take her. What he hadn't planned for, what no one in that clearing could have imagined in December 1979, was that the fire he built to destroy the evidence would leave behind exactly the thing that would identify him. 45 years later, Western Australia police detectives processed the scene at Boulder Rock and began reconstructing Karen Tate's final hours. They could account for her movements only up to 11 a.m. on Saturday, December 29th, the moment her friend dropped her on Barley Street. After that, every line of inquiry came up short. Officers canvassed Mount Lawley and the suburbs along the likely route to the hills. They interviewed her friends, the people she'd danced with at North Cotslow Surf Life Saving Club 2 nights earlier, and anyone connected to the inner-city arts community she moved through. One line of inquiry consumed far more attention than it deserved. Karen had attended 13 introductory talks on witchcraft in the months before her death, never joining a coven, just curious. But Boulder Rock, the clearing where she was found, was a site local Wicca groups used for rituals. Perth's tabloids seized on the connection and ran with it for weeks. A self-described warlock from a Fremantle coven even called the Daily News to publicly deny any link to her death. Police pursued the lead anyway. They looked into everyone connected to the lectures Karen had attended. They found nothing and formally rejected the theory. The newspapers kept running the story regardless, for months after detectives had already moved on. Meanwhile, what detectives did have, the one piece of physical evidence with any real potential, was the unknown male DNA profile recovered from what the fire had left behind at the clearing. In 1979, it was useless. DNA fingerprinting did not exist as a forensic tool. The science that could extract a genetic signature from biological material was still 5 years from being invented at a university in England. The first criminal case it would ever solve was 7 years away. There was no database to search, no technique to run it through, nothing to do with it except preserve it and hope. So that's what they did. Officers sealed the evidence and put it into storage. The case went cold. Karen Tate's file moved from one generation of detectives to the next, each one reading the same original interview notes, the same crime scene photographs, each one asking the same question. Had the science caught up yet? For a long time, the answer was always no. Karen Tate's death never fully left Perth's public consciousness. It resurfaced through anniversaries, newspaper retrospectives, podcasts, and television features that returned to her story year after year, long after most cold cases fade from memory entirely. At some point during one of those rounds of media coverage, the Tate family released a statement. Hearing Karen's name, seeing her face again, still brought them to their knees, they said. It still broke their hearts. They asked that if anyone knew anything at all, they come forward so the family could at least understand what had happened to her. In January 2024, the official Cold Case Western Australia podcast, produced by the state police force itself, dedicated an episode to Karen's murder. Host Neil Poe sat down with her siblings and asked them about their memories of Karen, and what they still hoped for, 44 years on. At the time that episode aired, the DNA profile recovered from the clearing at Boulder Rock was still sitting in the state database. No match, no name, just a number in a system waiting. But somewhere between the pain of that podcast episode and the tools that already existed elsewhere in the world, something had already started to change. In the early 2020s, the Western Australia Cold Case Unit turned to a technique that had already been rewriting the rules of unsolved crime around the world: investigative genetic genealogy. It works outside police databases entirely. Instead of searching for a criminal record, investigators compare a crime scene DNA profile against the genetic data of ordinary people, millions of them, who had voluntarily sent their DNA to commercial ancestry websites to trace their family trees and find distant relatives. If anyone in those databases shared enough DNA with the unidentified man from the clearing to be a biological relative, the system would flag it. From there, investigators could work backward, building a family tree branch by branch until they arrived at the one person it belonged to. This wasn't theoretical. It was the same method that had already cracked one of the most notorious cold cases in American history. In 2018, investigators in California used this exact technique to identify the Golden State Killer, a man responsible for at least 13 murders and over 50 rapes across the 1970s and 80s, caught decades later not through a database of criminals, but through a family tree built from his relatives' curiosity about their own ancestry. Western Australia detectives had already used the same approach to solve several historic sex offenses and missing persons cases. It worked. It had a track record. In 2024, Karen Tate's case became the next test. The DNA profile pulled from that scorched clearing at Boulder Rock 45 years earlier, the profile that had sat in evidence storage since before DNA fingerprinting even existed as a forensic science, was handed to the unit's genealogy team and uploaded into the system. The search came back with hits. The killer's biological relatives were in the database. Detectives began building the tree. The family tree started small, a handful of confirmed genetic matches, distant cousins who had no idea why a detective was suddenly interested in their ancestry. But family trees don't stay small. They branch. Parents lead to siblings, siblings lead to children, Children lead to cousins twice and 3 times removed, spreading outward across generations and across the country. By the time detectives had mapped it out fully, the tree held more than 10,000 people. That number wasn't a breakthrough. It was a beginning. Somewhere inside that sprawling web of relatives, grandparents, second cousins, in-laws, people who had never met each other and never would, was one man who had stood in a Jarrah clearing in December 1979 with a piece of wood in his hand. Finding him meant elimination, not discovery. Detectives worked through the tree branch by branch, checking each male relative in the plausible age range against residential records, employment history, and, critically, proximity to Perth in December 1979. Men who were too young were cut. Men who were too old were cut. Men who'd been living interstate or overseas, or who had solid records placing them somewhere else entirely on the day Karen died. Cut one by one. 10,000 became 1,000. 1,000 became 100. Each cut wasn't a guess. It was a fact checked against a name, a date, a location, the same slow, methodical work that had taken investigators nowhere for 4.5 decades, except this time the tree gave them a boundary. A finite number of people it could possibly be, shrinking with every record pulled. And then it wasn't 100 anymore. It was one name. His name was Terence John Fisher. He was born on February 11, 1950, in Mount Lawley, the exact same suburb where Karen Tate had been dropped off on Barley Street on the last morning of her life. Same streets, same neighborhood. He hadn't come from somewhere else. He'd grown up practically next door to where her final confirmed sighting took place. In December 1979, when Karen died, Fisher was 29 years old, living in Rivervale and Manning, suburbs just across the Swan River from Mount Lawley, close enough that crossing between them was nothing. He wasn't a drifter or a stranger passing through. He had a service record. The Australian Army, 1970 to 1972, mostly based in Townsville. He'd married in 1973. His mother had died earlier in 1979, the same year Karen was killed. 2 years after the murder, Fisher separated from his wife. The couple never had children. By trade, he was a carpenter, employed by the Public Works Department, building government buildings across Perth and regional Western Australia. Later, he took a voluntary redundancy and ran his own carpentry business until he died. Outside of work, Fisher was a member of the Fremantle Sailing Club, where he raced offshore and socialized with the regulars for years. Through the early 1980s, in a warehouse in Carlisle, he built a yacht of his own, a project that took him years to finish. He launched it in 1985. When he wasn't at the club, he drank at pubs around Manning, Victoria Park, and Carlisle, ordinary suburban haunts, the kind of places where everybody knows your name and nobody asks hard questions. He lived with his father in Manning until August 27, 2000, when he died of natural causes in a Perth hospital. He was 50 years old. In his entire life, Terence Fisher was never questioned about Karen Tate. Never listed as a person of interest. No arrest ever put his DNA into a police database, which is precisely why the case sat unsolved for 45 years despite every database search coming back empty. His family had no reason to suspect him. His friends had no reason to suspect him. The men he raced yachts with at the Fremantle Sailing Club, season after season, had no reason to think he was anything other than the man they thought they knew. And it didn't stop with Karen. Detectives had 2 other case files open. 2 more women found dead in the same stretch of Jarrah country southeast of Perth. If Terence Fisher were alive today, they would have been questioning him about both. The first was Barbara and Weston, a 38-year-old mother of 2 from East Victoria Park. On the night of Friday, June 27, 1986, she'd been drinking at the Balmoral Hotel and Irene's Park Tavern along Albany Highway, wearing a distinctive orange parka. She left the tavern around 11:30 p.m. She never made it home. In March 1991, 2 people out collecting firewood near Canning Dam, Carrigaline, found her bones in a small clearing 15 meters into the bush. Her personal items were recovered under a fallen tree trunk nearby. Barbara had been left in the same stretch of forest where Karen Tate was killed 7 years earlier, just 500 meters from where Karen was found. For years, suspicion in Barbara's case fell on Catherine and David Burney, the notorious Perth couple who abducted and murdered 4 young women across 5 weeks in 1986. Detectives even took David Burney out to the site and walked him through it. But forensically, the Burneys were never linked to Barbara's death. While public attention stayed locked on the country's most infamous killers, the man whose DNA sat forgotten in an evidence locker from a clearing 7 years earlier was at the Fremantle Sailing Club, racing offshore. The second was Carrie Suzanne Turner, 18 years old, living with her parents in Beckenham. In the early hours of Sunday, June 30th, 1991, Carrie left a Perth nightclub called Pinocchio's and got in a taxi home. Partway through the trip, the driver realized she couldn't pay the fare and put her out on the causeway in East Perth. A second taxi picked her up, drove her as far as the corner of Shepperton Road and Miller Street in East Victoria Park, and dropped her there for the same reason. A witness at a nearby takeaway shop saw a dark blue car, possibly a Datsun 260C with spoked wheels, pull up behind her. The driver called out. She walked over, got in, and the car drove away. Her body was found 4 weeks later in bushland at Bedfordale, south of Perth. 3 women, 3 decades, each one last seen alive on the streets of inner-city Perth. Each one found dead in the same corridor of bush southeast of the city. Detectives believe Fisher may be responsible for all 3 deaths. He can never be questioned, charged, or tried for any of them. On March 12, 2025, Western Australia Police held a press conference and formally named Terence John Fisher as a suspect in the 1979 murder of Karen Tate. The genetic evidence linking him to the crime scene, they said, was strong. His family had been informed and were cooperating with the investigation. Acting Assistant Commissioner Paul Coombs spoke first. In the 45 years since Karen's death, he said, they had never stopped trying to find the person responsible. Countless investigators had worked the case over the decades. They might never know his motive, but with the public's help, they hoped to bring some comfort to the Tate family. Detective Acting Senior Sergeant Dion Selby, the lead investigator, asked the public to come forward with anything they remembered about Fisher's movements and routines. Police already knew a great deal about him, Selby said. They simply wanted to know more. Karen's sister, Anne-Marie, later spoke to the Cold Case Western Australia podcast. It meant a great deal, she said, because it gave her faith in the detectives, and in everyone who had worked the case over the years. And it gave her something else, peace of mind. He was obviously deceased, she said. He was not going to hurt anybody else. Her brother, Matt, put it differently. There was something strange about the whole thing, he said. Somebody doesn't just kill somebody for any odd reason. She carried a black motorcycle helmet everywhere she went. She never went anywhere without it, ready for whatever ride came next, right up until the ride that took her into the Jarrah Forest and never brought her back. 45 years. That's how long the answer sat sealed in an evidence locker, waiting for science to catch up to a fire that was supposed to erase it. Terence John Fisher was already 25 years dead by the time anyone spoke his name in connection with Karen Tate. He built his yacht. He raced it out of Fremantle. He drank at his local pubs in Manning and Victoria Park. He lived out an entire ordinary life and died in a hospital bed, having never once answered for what happened at Boulder Rock. And, if police are right, for what happened to Barbara Weston and Carrie Turner too. There was no arrest. There was no trial. There was only a name, finally spoken, 45 years too late for anyone to do anything with it except know. For Karen's family, that was still something. Not justice, but an ending of a kind. A name where there had only ever been a question mark. Would you want to know, even if there was nothing left to do with the answer? Let me know in the comments. If this case stayed with you, there are more solved cases waiting. Subscribe and I'll bring you the next one.